And it's not that we have more emotion than neurotypical people, but it's that we feel more emotion. So ADHD ultimately is an issue with dopamine dysregulation, and it means our brains, either it's that we make less dopamine or we process it differently, but this absolutely affects emotional regulation, which means criticism hits us harder.
You are listening to My Rejection Story, hosted by Alice Draper. Welcome back to My Rejection Story. Today's guest is Tracy Otsuka. Tracy is on a mission to change the way we talk about ADHD, especially for women. She is the host of the hit podcast, ADHD for Smart Ass Woman, which has racked up millions of downloads. And she's also the author of the best-selling book, ADHD for Smart Ass Woman, How to Fall in Love with Your Neurodivergent Brain. Tracy is a leading voice in challenging the outdated male-centric model of ADHD and showing how qualities like intensity, ambition, and emotional depth, which are so often labeled as too much, can actually be our superpowers. Tracy, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. I am delighted to be here, Alice.
I'm delighted to be here. It's on the other side because I joined you for an episode of your show. So to start the conversation, in the bio, I mentioned the label too much, and I'd love to hear from you about that label, and I guess whether you think that's an early rejection that many women with ADHD have been receiving from a young age, being assigned that label of being too much.
Yeah, I absolutely believe that's true. Women with ADHD, we are just more sensitive to criticism due to a combination of neurology, socialization, and I would say lived experience. So there's something that is only found with ADHD, which is called RSD, or rejection-sensitive dysphoria. And what that is an intense emotional reaction to perceived or actual criticism or rejection. And it's not that we have more emotion than neurotypical people, but it's that we feel more emotion. So ADHD ultimately is an issue with dopamine dysregulation, and it means our brains, either it's that we make less dopamine or we process it differently. They're not 100% sure, but this absolutely affects emotional regulation, which means criticism hits us harder. I've heard, studies that there's actual physical pain from criticism. On top of that, we have social conditioning, right? Especially for women. Gender roles and stereotypes tell us that we have to be organized as women. We have to be organized and calm and nurturing and always on top of everything. We're not only supposed to manage ourselves, but also the household and children and family, and we're the social secretaries. So ADHD, we know, makes those roles harder to perform because our brains are wired differently. We're not defective, we're not disordered, our brains are wired differently, but instead of getting support, we get shame. Instead of being seen as, oh, well, she's just struggling, let's figure out what works for her, we're labeled as lazy or messy or dramatic or, as you said, too much. And that's not just unfair, it's also sexist, because when you think about it, the reason why women struggle much more with ADHD than men is because men are never held to that standard. They forget a birthday and it's, oh, that's just typical guy stuff. All guys forget birthdays. We forget, and it's a moral failing. And if you think about it, if he's a single dad managing work and kids, people expect that he'll have a housekeeper, maybe a nanny, maybe a tutor for his child. That is seen as smart delegation. But we, as women, if we do the same, we're shamed for it. We're told we should be able to do it all. You miss a school event and, oh, well, he's working so hard for the family. We miss it and it's like bad mom, right? So it's this double standard. And when you layer ADHD on top of it, it becomes a no-win proposition. And so this leads to ADHD women becoming expert at hiding their struggles. They mask, they become perfectionists. Look, if I can't do it perfectly, I'm not going to do it at all. Or I'm only going to do so much and never really get to that next level because what happens if, I screw up or I don't do it right? And so a lot of times we can also fall into this learned helplessness. So what that means is we let other people make decisions for us. And often when we let other people make decisions for us, it can also be a cop-out, right? If a problem happens because of the decision that was made, it's not my problem. But in effect, what ends up happening is we don't make decisions for ourselves that are rooted in who we are and what we want. And when that happens, we stop living our life because we're living their life. I also think if we struggled in school or at home, there's a history of you're too loud, you're too much, you're not enough, you don't try hard enough. And after years of being told you're disorganized, too emotional, lazy, all of the things, that is exactly why we become so sensitive to criticism. And then the final thing that I would mention is we are often highly intuitive. If you can't rely on your brain, you start to develop your intuition, right? Your other senses. And what that means is we become hyper aware and we recognize patterns naturally. So ADHD brains, we often we pick up on subtleties that others miss. So it might be the tone of how something was said, or the side eye that we catch that nobody else would notice, or that tiny pause that's just a little bit too long. And so what ends up happening is when you're reading the room 24/7, you're getting all of this information in, all of this stimulation. And so, of course, it can cause us to be more anxious because we're better at seeing those subtle nuances that most people, they don't even get. They're like, what are you talking about? And then, 3 months down the road, that thing that you were, intuiting was going to happen actually happens. And you're like, oh, well, I guess I should have trusted my own intuition. So is that kind of what you were looking for?
Yes, I'm going to backtrack because you covered so much and I want to chat about it more, but just on the intuition, I mean, on so many of these points, but the intuition, I totally relate. And I now trust my intuition wholeheartedly. There's no doubting that anymore. But before we dive into, the socialization, and you touched on so many important points, can you talk to me about what you know about what is happening in our brain when we're rejected? Because I know you touched on, there is wiring, there is dopamine. Would you be able to kind of break down, like, let's say I propose something to someone and they say, Alice, you're really bad at what you do, you suck at this, and I immediately feel terrible and I don't want to put myself out there professionally again. What is happening in my brain?
Well, we know that we have more emotion. And so I believe that what happens is you have all of this outsized emotion that floods your brain. And so in effect, what's happening is it's shutting down your prefrontal cortex. Your prefrontal cortex is the front of the brain. It's responsible for your executive functions. Your executive functions are what we struggle with ADHD: planning and scheduling and time management and emotional regulation. So all of those things that you need to actually make I hate to use how about make decisions go offline? And so everything becomes harder. Have you experienced that where the emotion kicks up and you literally feel like you're spinning and your brain is just shutting down, and it's almost like the emotion is growing when in fact what you need is a way to calm your nervous system so you can actually make a decision that serves you? And so I think what happens a lot of times is when you're in that state, it's like, oh, you just make the decision. And then it's the wrong decision. It's a decision that doesn't suit you and doesn't fit who you are and what you need.
Yeah. I always say I kind of get into this reactive state and I will be asked, what are you thinking? And I'm like, it feels like my brain is offline. There are no thoughts.
Yeah.
And if I don't catch myself in time, I can, get into a defensive state, which is not productive. And so, yeah, I completely understand what you're saying. I mean, at least I can physically imagine how it feels. So you talk a bit on the gendered side of how women especially have been shamed in the sense, and I can see it just anecdotally around me is that men are often given a lot more room to be hyperactive, and boys will be boys is a saying that's often said, and we don't extend that same grace to girls. So yeah, like on the socialization side, when girls are shamed from such a young age for, I guess, all the things that could show up as ADHD symptoms, and that could be hyperactivity, it could be being
themselves.
messy. Yeah, for me, it was being messy. It was like, oh my gosh, I'm not a real girl, like being so messy. And then it leads to learned helplessness. And I thought that was a very interesting term that you touched on. Is learned helplessness, am I correct in saying that that is when you almost give up on trying to put yourself... Yeah?
Absolutely. I mean, if you try to do things your way and you're constantly shut down, at what point is it actually self-preservation to say, you know what, I'm not even going to try? Because no matter what I do or recommend, it's going to get shut down. It's not going to be the right thing. I'm not doing it their way. I'm not doing it their correct, what they think is the correct way. So why do I even bother? Because what's happening is it's just criticism on top of criticism, and you're trying to stop the criticism. Now, some girls get oppositional. Like I would probably be, in that class where, well, it's screw you. I'm not going to do it your way. I'm going to do it my own way. But other girls, probably more of the inattentive type girl. So there's 3 types of ADHD. And girls have 2 times the rate of inattention. So there's the more hyperactive, traditionally boy kind of ADHD, right? Where you're climbing up the walls. You are annoying to everyone around you, including your parents, your teachers, your coaches. There's another kind of ADHD called inattentive ADHD that girls have are much more likely to be diagnosed with. And inattentive ADHD kind of looks like the daydreamy girl in the back of the classroom who's not paying any attention, doesn't know what subject she's in, let alone that she's in school, because she has such a rich fantasy world. It's the inner hyperactivity. Her brain is active rather than her physical body. And so what happens there is these girls tend to be really nice girls. They're people pleasers. They want to make everyone around them happy. And so instead of externalizing their symptoms and being annoying like boys and getting in trouble, getting in fights, talking back to the teacher, they don't do any of that. They sit in the back and they're in their head beating themselves up. So whereas boys externalize their symptoms, girls internalize them. And so what happens? Those are the girls that get diagnosed with anxiety and depression, which they may have anxiety and depression, but often it's ADHD that underlies the anxiety and depression, because you can imagine if you can't trust your brain and you're like, nothing I do seems to be working right, you would get anxious and maybe over time get depressed. But often when you treat the ADHD symptoms, the anxiety and depression goes away. Girls are also diagnosed later, typically. They're usually diagnosed in puberty. What we have learned about ADHD in girls is that estrogen regulates dopamine. And dopamine is what our brains don't make enough of or process differently. So when you think about during the lifespan of a woman, when do hormones, estrogen specifically, when do they start bouncing around? In puberty? In pregnancy, postpartum, perimenopause, and menopause. And so it's those stages in a woman's life where you will see ADHD symptoms rearing their head. There's something called, I don't know if it's called that. This is what I call it, maturity-onset ADHD. I have met woman after woman diagnosed in their late 40s and 50s. And, it coincides with perimenopause and menopause. If your estrogen is bouncing around, you're making less and less dopamine. Let's say, because we all have symptoms when we were younger, at least starting in puberty. And so you may have a lot of the really good fiery symptoms like, the irreverence and the energy and the entrepreneurialism and, the honestly confidence, because confidence comes through action. And so if as a girl you've learned that when I'm in action, people like that and I move forward, right? You may be very successful and also have ADHD, and you know that, I'm not as organized as I wish I was. I need, an assistant always to kind of help me. And if I don't have one, I get a little bit anxious because I am not. So I always say we're really great starters, we're okay middlers, and we're not very good finishers. That's kind of when the work gets boring. And so that's when it's really helpful to have support like an admin or, people that work under you.
We were talking about learned helplessness, and going back to that, you touched on action, and I heard this in some of your podcast episodes where you talk about how action fires dopamine, and I definitely experienced that, where I love ticking things off my to-do list. I love doing things, but then there's the reverse side of that, which is like when I can't get myself to do the things. And at the heart of this podcast is I want to get people out of, I guess, the learned helplessness side, whether or not they have ADHD, regret minimization framework that I really talk about with rejection, is that we generally regret things we didn't do versus the things we did do. So I want to move people into action-based mode because, fearing self-rejection is the worst rejection, and that's when we stop ourselves from putting ourselves out there. So my question for you is, if there are people with ADHD who are stuck in a space of not being in action mode, they're not putting themselves out there because they're so afraid of the rejections, because maybe they experienced very early rejections in childhood, which is very likely, or because of rejection-sensitive dysphoria. What advice would you have to move towards action ADHD, where you're getting those dopamine hits of taking action and you're getting some rejection and bad feedback along the way, because that's part and parcel of putting yourself out there? But yeah, any feedback on moving from not taking action, learned helplessness, to action-based?
Well, first of all, I want to say that, hold on one second. I'm going to write this down because I'm afraid I'm going to forget it.
I have so many notes so that I can remember what follow-up questions I want to ask.
As you mentioned, sometimes there's trauma. And as you can imagine, all of this rejection over time, all of these little cuts, they're little T traumas, and they can amass into one big T trauma. So my first bit of advice is get yourself a good therapist if this is what you struggle with, because you may try everything and not be able to actually get into action and get the work done, and then you're just beating yourself up over and over again. So assuming you have done work to process the trauma, my advice is always that I don't believe that ADHD is a productivity problem. I believe it's an identity problem. And so the first thing that you must do is figure out who you are in your ADHD. We also know that the ADHD brain is a brain of interest. So when we are interested, there is no stopping us. We will shoot for the moon and just about reach it. But when we are not interested, like for a lot of us in school, where, the education system goes wide instead of deep, and you're required to take these classes that you could care less about. You're never going to use it. And I think a lot of ADHD kids, we ask a lot of questions. Well, why does it have to be that way? And couldn't it be this way? And how could how could we flip this and make it better? And we can be kind of annoying, right, to the adults in our life that are just trying to get through the lesson plan. But the truth of the matter is that's curiosity, and that is one of our biggest gifts. So I think it behooves us to get really curious around what it is that's always lit us up. What are we passionate about? What is important to you? What are our values? What are our just natural born strengths? And then of all the passions that we have, which is the one that really pulls us forward. And we, rather than us feeling like we have to push a boulder, it kind of pulls us in. And then, of course, the neighborhood where our purpose lives in. So if you take all of those things and you find the sweet spot where they all intersect, that is the area that you should be working in first and foremost. Because in that area, you are going to have sometimes none of the ADHD symptoms that you will have in other areas. We are really mission-driven people. We have to feel like we're making a difference in life. And when we feel like we're not, it's almost impossible for us to move forward. So first, I would say, really figure out what is your area of interest. Then, the other thing about the ADHD brain is we have to be in positive emotion. If we are not in positive emotion, can't get anything done. And if you think about it, the things that you've struggled with an ADHD brain, you're never in positive emotion. You're in negative emotion. And you know how we talked about the prefrontal cortex? Well, when you're in negative emotion, your prefrontal cortex is offline. When you're in positive emotion, it's working, So if you can look at the areas of interest and make sure you're in that sweet spot, and then that you are in positive emotion. So how do you get something done when you have an ADHD brain? You have to make it fun, challenging, and or social. Sure, we can do the last minute fear thing, but over time, that just wreaks havoc with your nervous system. And so, you may be able to have a career where the way you get stuff done is you scare the crap out of you, but over time, that's just not going to work. So I would always ask myself, what can I do to make this fun? What can I do to make this challenging? And then what can I do to make it social? And if you can combine all of them, that's probably a great thing. So I really struggled to write my book. I'm like Dorothy Parker. I joke about, I'm a terrible writer, but I'm a fantastic editor. And for me, what I struggle with is the points that I want, like you're a writer, right? So you probably can't relate to this, but I struggle with all these things I want to say, and how do I organize them in a way that makes sense to the reader? It always makes sense to me. And so when I had to write this book, no matter how hard I tried, everybody said, oh, get up really early in the morning and just knock it out. I could not write for the life of me before 2:00. And that's really weird because for me, I am a, early bird gets the worm kind of person. If I'm in bed past 7:00, I feel like I'm late.
Yeah.
I could not, for the life of me, start writing at 2:00. And so what I realized I had to do is ask myself, how do I make it fun? How do I make it challenging? How do I make it social? And so what worked for me is the bulk of my book was either written in coffee shops, hotels, or libraries. Because the social part was, usually my husband would come with me, but even when he wasn't there, I had less of that FOMO because I looked around and I saw everybody else working. So I didn't feel like, oh, it's just poor me locked in my office, And I would make it fun by doing things like, okay, I'm going to work for 3 hours, and then I'm going to take a break at 1:00. And at 1:00, I'm going to go for a walk with the dogs around the neighborhood. I'm going to stop in a coffee shop. We're going to have a break. We're going to grab lunch, whatever, just something to look forward to. And then if I went back and I worked till 5:00, which is usually when the library was closed, I'm thinking on weekends, because I did a lot of the writing on weekends, then we would go out for dinner. Challenging would be, okay, well, I finished the first draft of that last chapter in, I don't know, a day, let's say 7 hours of writing. Can I do the next chapter in 6 hours? So it was always kind of pushing myself using fun, challenging, and social. Again, though, you also want, so if you are in your area of interest, then it is your intention. We are not. So most people we have an interest-based nervous system. Most people have an importance-based nervous system. If someone in their life thinks it's important that they accomplish something, then they can do it. We're not like that. It is really a struggle. So what we have to do is, even if there's something we don't want to do that really we have to figure out how can we have intention behind it. So there may be something I really don't want to do, but I know it's really important to my husband. And so I have to skew it so that it becomes my intention. Well, okay, I don't want to do that thing, but I know it's really important to my husband. And I know I love him. And when I do kind things for him, he does kind things for me. So it is going to be my intention that because he's such a good guy and I want to have, a good relationship with him where he cares about things that maybe I don't care about and I care about things that maybe are less important to me. So I build intention through the back door, right? Ultimately, it serves me to care about him. And so I adopt that as my intention. And then in order for you to change anything, you've got to change your identity first. So I am the kind of person that, or I am the kind of person who, and I'll finish the sentence so that I take on the identity of the kind of person. I am the kind of person who writes for 7 hours every Saturday. It's an intention for me. I really wanted to write this book, and I want to finish this book, and I want to make sure that this book changes other women's lives like my podcast has. And so the intention is built there. And so in order to do that thing that I really want to do, I've got to build a new identity. And so it's always this, I am the kind of person. And it can start with something as simple as drinking a glass of water every morning. That's kind of where it started for me. I knew I was dehydrated. And when you think about our brains, they need water, and most of our brains are not getting enough water. So it's this little dehydrated brain, and I would have that vision in my head. And so first thing in the morning on my way to working out, I would literally pass by the water. We're in the country, so we're on a well, so we have a water filtration thing. I would pass by it, and I stack the two together. I'm walking by the sink on the way to work out, and so there's the water, and I'm going to drink the water. And so what you're doing when you connect intention and identity is you are actually becoming more trustworthy to you. It is something you want to accomplish. You are doing it, and then you're proud of yourself. And what do you think happens when we're proud of ourselves? Screw anybody else being proud of you. That does not matter. Sometimes I'll say, I'm proud for you, but I would never tell my children I'm proud of you, because my opinion, I hope I've raised them in a way that they do respect my opinion, and they'll come to me to process how they feel about something and to help them. But I want to make sure that my kids know that it's most important that they're proud of them. So whenever you make a commitment to yourself and you actually follow through, it is the reverse of learned helplessness, because you are doing something in your life that then you are proud of you for doing. And guess what? That generates positive emotion. And that's what also skews our motivation, because we don't really do motivation. We don't do that, what's that? Nike just do it kind of, motivation. We do inspiration. We have to feel it internally, feel the positive emotion, and that is what allows us to get the thing done and then get future things done, because every time you feel positive emotion, that's dopamine.
Yeah, thank you. There's so many nuggets there, and the social, challenging, and fun. I've never heard it described in that way, and I can see it in terms of when I feel most motivated to work. Is I have this terrible habit where I'll delay things if I have nothing on my calendar, and then I'll suddenly get started at just before bedtime, and then have to stay up late. But if my calendar is full because I have dinner plans and I have lunch plans and I need to fit my work in between, that's when I feel like a normal human that can fit their work into normal working hours and not stay up all night working. So
Right.
yeah, I love that strategy. It's
I
just
have a great
brilliant.
hack for that, actually, for just starting, because procrastination is about emotion. It is about
Yeah.
how you feel about starting, and you get stuck in that. So I'm curious, maybe we talked about this, although I kind of doubt it. Have I ever shared is this a video podcast?
Yes, you can share
Oh,
visuals.
it is. Have I ever shared my time cube?
No, I don't think so.
Oh my
It's
gosh.
like Pomodoro
This,
technique.
I have never met anyone where this hasn't worked. Okay, so this is perfect. You have all the time in the world. You don't really have any appointments or meetings. There's a certain thing that you want to get done for you, and you cannot start. And you're sitting there and you're screwing around and you're not getting anything done. And honestly, that's all negative emotion, right? Because then you're beating yourself up because you haven't done anything. And then you have to work late. And then when you work late, you throw your circadian rhythm up because you go to bed late. And so then, the morning start, like it just becomes this big cycle. So this is what you do. They often tell us to do the Pomodoro method. We struggle to start, but we also struggle to stop. So why on God's green earth would we do the Pomodoro method where we finally start, we work for 25 minutes, and then we stop for 5 minutes and take a break? Are you kidding me? No, I would never do that because it took so much for me to start. Why would I stop? But that's neurotypical advice. So this cube called, used to be called the Datex cube, and it's now called the time cube. This is the deal I strike with myself. And Alice, I have no idea why it works because you'd think my brain would have figured out I'm playing this trick on it. When I'm all in my
taking notes.
when I'm all in my head and I want to start but I can't start, this is the deal I strike with myself. Tracy, all you have to do is 25 minutes. If after 25 minutes you want to stop, you may. And then what I do is I turn it on its head, and can you see how the timer is counting down?
Yeah, yeah.
So the beauty of this timer is there's no friction because I don't have to go to my phone and find an app. I don't have to go pull the timer out of the kitchen and turn it on. This thing sits on my desk, and when I feel like I'm spinning it in my head and I can't start, I grab it, and all I do is I turn it over, 25 minutes. I can stop after 25 minutes. Alice, do you know I have never stopped after 25 minutes in 7 years of doing this? I don't know why it works. I think it's just the getting into action and overriding your brain and using what we know works for us, which is once we start, we can't stop. So often I am then sitting for 2-3 hours getting more done than I had expected. This is magic. This is honestly probably my best hack.
I will share this in the show notes, and I will also be looking for one to order because I tried the Pomodoro technique just earlier today, and just as you described, I messed around for the first 2 Pomodoros. I didn't get started, and then once I finally got started, I did not stop after the 25 minutes. I just worked for like 4 hours straight, but it just took a while to get into that zone. So yeah, I'm definitely going to be looking that up. That's awesome.
Unfortunately, they don't make, I love this one because it's beautiful bamboo, it's elegant, it sits on your desk. Unfortunately, the company, I don't know, I think they might have sold to or changed their name. It's a different company, I believe. And so now I think the 25-minute one comes in red and white, and it's plastic. So it's not as pretty, but it still works. And really the key is that it's just so easy to get into it,
Yeah. Okay, well, hopefully there's something available. I'll go look online after this recording. Diving into your story a little bit. So I know that you got diagnosed soon after your son's diagnosis, and that the psychologist told you to lower your expectations for your son. Could you share a little bit about that story, your son's diagnosis, and how that eventually led to your diagnosis?
Yeah, so my son was 9 years old when he started to struggle in school and started to become really anxious about school. Prior to that time, he was killing it. And I mean killing it. like in second grade, they pick one child. No, they pick two. They pick a girl and a boy to read. He went to a Catholic school, and they have some Christmas, thing. And they pick one child to read, and they didn't. They had him do the whole thing because he was just so good at reading and everything. And so it didn't make sense. And if you talked to him, you could tell how bright and curious he was. And when he was interested in something, like World War II was his thing, World War II and baseball. Like in baseball, he didn't just learn who the players were in that era. He started from the beginning, and you could ask him any question about any player of all time, and he would know everything about them, including all of their stats. So we were like, how could he be struggling in school? And it started with math. He's so good at math. He's like calculating stuff in his head. It made no sense. And I thought initially it was Catholic school, and they used to have 10 math problems every night. It was when they jumped to 30 math problems. And Marcus is the kind of kid, he can get you the right answer, but he can't show how he got there. He just does it in his head. And everything was really fast. And so it made no sense. And so we had a really good principal who actually had a son similar to Marcus. And she's like, let's get him tested. We got him tested. They couldn't figure out what it was. Then we went to an occupational therapist. The anxiety, though, was there. And at one point, he went to a child psychiatrist, and the child psychiatrist said, I think he's going to be okay. And the way it showed was when we would take him to school, he would have to stop all the time to go to the bathroom. And so we thought, oh, well, maybe there's something medical, And it just went on and on like that for 3 years. Finally, wow. At the age of 12, we had someone that we were working with when we were moving him from school to school said, I think he might have nonverbal learning disorder. Except for he was so social. Like that was his gift. Like he was just, the kid that all the kids were connected to. And I thought, well, or maybe, maybe he's on the autism spectrum, but then the social stuff didn't make sense. So we got him diagnosed, did the whole neuropsychological evaluation, neuropsych evaluation. Yeah. And it came back that he had ADHD, and I was just in shock because I didn't know what ADHD was. I thought it meant you're all over the place, you're not very smart, and you're going to struggle. And everything I knew about ADHD did not fit this kid, other than he could be kind of obstinate. And so we met with a child psychologist who was supposedly an expert in ADHD. She came highly recommended by 2 teachers that we really respected. Met with her 3 times. The first time she met with the whole family, then she met with just Marcus, and then it was with my husband and me. And she is the one who said, your son is far too ambitious. If you don't reduce his expectations, he will be disappointed in life. And that was when I thought, hell no. Why would you ever? I don't care if your child is intellectually disabled. Why would you reduce their expectations? It just made no sense to me. So we never went back. And I started learning everything I could about ADHD. But because it looks different in women and girls than it looks like in boys, I was actually a very good student. I was a total people pleaser, wanted to do really well, had to work harder than everybody else, but I did well. I mean, I went to law school and graduate law school. And, again, I always felt like, well, you must not be as smart because I would work so hard. Everybody would take my outlines. They were beautiful. And then they would study a few days before. I had been studying for weeks, and they would always get a half a grade higher than I did. And I was just like, it must just mean that I'm not very smart. So it took 8 months for me to see his ADHD in me because, again, our symptoms were so different.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm glad you went separate ways from the psychologist that shared that feedback on him. And I completely relate to you. I heard you talking about another podcast, working so hard on those notes, and then everyone else getting half a grade higher when they studied off your notes, because the memorization was the thing I always complained about in school. And I remember biology specifically, because we had to memorize a lot for biology. I'd go home and, just like you, spend hours and hours writing notes and studying those notes. And my friends in my class would say that they just sat there and listened to the teacher. And then they examined on that. And I was like, something is wrong with my brain. Like, what do you mean you just sat there and listened?
Alice, if your teacher sat down with you and talked you through the exam, I bet you would have easily gotten an A because you knew the material. I think it's, first of all, the limited time to organize your thoughts, and we prepare the best we can, but I think we have this idea that, okay, this is what's going to be on the test. And so when it isn't, it's that, the panic, and then trying to reorganize, right? Okay, I came in expecting to be tested on this, and now they're talking about that. Okay, how does it all integrate? And I think it's the anxiousness that then throws your prefrontal cortex offline, your executive functions, and that's what makes it so much harder. Versus if I had an opportunity to talk it through, I think it would have been so much easier. And I know Marcus said that all the time too.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I mean, definitely like collaborative conversations, but that's not really what the school system, at least when I was in school, was built on. It was built on teachers talking to you and you remembering what the teachers said. Yeah. So when we think of rejection, do you think that with being undiagnosed for so long, do you think that should negatively shaped? I mean, of course, you were just talking about thinking that your peers were smarter than you, but we know the science. We know that, I mean, I guess it's not science, the studies that people with ADHD experience far more negative comments by the age of 12. I think it's like thousands compared to someone without
20,000,
ADHD. 20,000. So how do you think that affected the way you viewed yourself? And did the diagnosis change that view?
So for me, yes, absolutely, because now I understand how my brain works. And I actually, I was diagnosed, and then I went back and I went through the whole battery, the neuropsych, evaluation, like what a child would get. And I was so surprised. I'd never had an IQ test before. I was really surprised at, especially in math. Like I had this idea that I'm like Barbie. I hate math, like stupid crap like that I would say in my brain, and I'd say it out loud too. Yet I remember there was one math class, trigonometry, where I got an A+, the highest grade in the class. And my entire life I was like, how could I have gotten an A+ if I'm bad at math? Well, what I remember about trigonometry is it's very structured and organized. And once you give me a system that works for my brain, I'm going to run rings around anybody else who doesn't have a system. So, versus geometry was hard for me. And I think it's the visual spatial part. And we know that with ADHD comes some differences in how we learn and what, parts of our brain, there's like learning challenges. And I'm pretty sure there's some visual, spatial something, and I think that's what the neuropsych evaluation said as well. But it was, it's subclinical. It's not to the level where it's really a problem. But you can imagine if there's a bunch of little things and you're a little bit off here and a little bit off there, and and you add it all together, it can make school a lot harder. And I always felt I am smarter, even though I did perform well in school. I have always felt that I'm smarter than how I perform. And for me, if I could have only had exams that were written and they were like take home, I could have completely killed it in a much shorter period of time. But it's the integrating everything and then dealing with the anxiety of the brain that's like, okay, wait, where am I hanging my, where's the hook? Where am I going with this? That I think, it is always going to be a problem for me. And I think that sometimes, as you were just alluding to, the rejection comes from within too. I'm going to give you an example. So a couple weeks ago, I went down to Santa Barbara to work with a company that sells trainings to the likes of LinkedIn and Google and Meta. Is it Meta or Meta? Whatever it is. And, one of the trainings was on procrastination. The other training was on, leaning into your strengths. So they weren't specific to ADHD. Anybody could use them. And so at the end, I had written the trainings. I had this amazing producer. They were so good with, and I had it. It was all like I had prepared to the nines. It was all on teleprompter. I am so good with a teleprompter. I know how to work a teleprompter. And he was just like, you are the best that we've ever had. You are so good at this. So then what did they do? You are so good at this. We're trying this new thing, and it's more impromptu. And so they brought me up, and so I'm like, okay, I'll try it, knowing full well. And they wanted it to be about ADHD. 10 simple facts about ADHD. They wanted each one to be within 1 to 2 minutes, have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And, like at the beginning, you're introducing it, and then at the end, you're wrapping up. That is exactly what my brain can't do. I felt like, you're an airplane and you're just getting off the runway and they stop. Just getting off the runway and they stop. Like, I deliver nuggets as I'm speaking, but it's not in this organized beginning, middle, end fashion. It's like, it just sort of flies out. And, oh yeah, that was a good thought. Choose that one. And so I did it with them. It was the biggest disaster. And they were so nice. But again, I knew this is exactly not my forum. And I even knew what the different sections we were going to be talking about because I had created them. But because it was so last minute, I hadn't really done any rehearsing. I have no working memory. It was a disaster. And so what I did was I overrode my own knowing. I'd been in this situation before. Oh, no, you don't need a teleprompter. Here, we're going to feed you the line, and then you're going to send it back to me. I can't do that. I know what I needed. I knew that I needed a certain structure to do my best work, but I ignored it, and I chased someone else's idea of, spontaneity, right? And that this is the way we want to do it, and we want to make it, literally it was filmed with an iPhone and a ring light, and I'm sitting in a chair. It was just the weirdest thing. But it brought home again, okay, wait a minute. You know who you are. You know what you need. And again, you should have trusted that instead of honoring what someone else wanted to do. And a part of me was like, well, maybe I can do it this time. That's an ADHD thing, right? Maybe this is the right environment. I really like these people. Maybe I can do that. Well, no, I can't. I sucked at it. So again, it really is about knowing who you are and what works for you and sticking to that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that and being candid about it. Because, and I'm completely with you with the wanting to try something new. I think I have that tendency as well. But I really relate to what you're saying about the testing and the struggle with working memory. And I want to just say that in the episode I did on your show where you interviewed me, I think you asked me about how I performed in school. And I remember talking about how in university I did quite well. And what I will say is that my university degree, almost all my subjects let me do take-home exams. And that is probably a huge differentiator because just like you, I would panic in an exam room and panic that, it's you have the things there, and if you just get distracted, you will forget everything that you need to put on that page. It was kind of the feeling that I always felt in an exam setting. So I'm glad that you spoke about that. And also so many of my thoughts come to me as I talk. So that being able to deliver, like there's 5 words, great nugget, thinking before you talk.
Yes.
I've had lots of conversations with other people who do that, where I'm like, I don't know how to. This is why I talk so much. Like I'm leading to the conclusion.
It's that airplane analogy. We've got to get off the runway, and then things really start clicking. And so film the whole thing and then pull the best parts. Is my advice.
Yeah. I think that's the best advice. I love the airplane analogy. Well, Tracy, this episode has been amazing. Thank you for being here and for sharing your time. Before we wrap up, can you share with the listeners where they can find you? And I mean, I know you do a lot of work with women with ADHD, so where would be the best place for them to start, and how can they work with you?
Well, they can go to my book, ADHD for Smartass Women. A lot of ADHD women actually use the Audible. Because then you can be doing something else while you're listening to it, like gardening or driving or walking.
Gymming.
I also have a podcast of the same name, ADHD for Smartass Women. And there's my website, ADHDforsmartwomen.com. Everything is there.
Yeah, I think there's some great resources on the website. There's a free training, I believe.
Yeah.
So we'll have that all linked in the show notes.
Including,
Tracy, thank you
I should
so
say,
much.
my program that really builds the foundation, because I think the last thing women with ADHD need is another hack, planner, or routine. What we really need is to understand who we are, how our brains work, and how to stop living everyone else's life instead of our own.
Yeah, I completely agree. And yeah, I just think that falling into that I've fallen into the trap of thinking that the Pomodoro technique or some other program is going to be the solution. And your thoughts, your comments earlier on figuring out who you are to become more resilient to rejection. I just come back to an example all the time of a podcast guest on the show who spoke about being very rejection sensitive to acting, and she was in acting school, and it was only when she became a writer she realized she cared about it enough in order to withstand rejection. And yes, I just really appreciate all the insights you brought today. And for people listening, I think many of us who struggle with rejection might have ADHD, so I think you may really benefit from taking a look at Tracy's work, because rejection-sensitive dysphoria does make it harder for people with ADHD to navigate rejection. So thank you, Tracy. I really appreciate having you here and all the time you spent today.
Thank you, Alice. It was a pleasure.
This was My Rejection Story, hosted by me, Alice Draper.